Welcome to RIM 101 for Information Management Professionals. My name is Rick Sterling, and I'm the president of Western IM of Saskatoon. I'm also on the board of directors of ARMA Saskatchewan as a director at large, and I'm currently serving as the chair of the ARMA International Information Governance Professional Certification Board. Quite a mouthful. The Western IM team has specialized in all facets of enterprise information management and information governance across Canada for over 20 years. The ARMA Saskatchewan board has elected to use a webinar-based delivery mechanism for the program content today and in the future as well, in the hope that many more may be able to attend these program offerings. It does remove the need to travel, so it should be helpful to a lot of you. Please invite your colleagues from different professional disciplines in your organization to attend this series. Actually, this is the last presentation of this series. The 102 presentations will come after this, so they're all welcome to attend that as well. This should create a good discussion opportunities about corporate information management, governance, and the strategic alignment of all professional resources in your organizations. Just before we start, I thought I would speak briefly about the ARMA IGP program, the Governance Professional Certification Program, which we will look at in much more detail later in the presentation, since it ties in not only with this presentation, but the previous ones in this series as well. The ARMA IG certification was created to facilitate an overarching corporate information discipline, which could have the breadth of understanding to unify all of the strategic corporate information areas. This, of course, requires an understanding of risk, security, IT, legal, privacy, and records and information management, as well as all the other complementary corporate disciplines in your organization. With the digital transformation occurring either right now or soon to occur in most organizations, along with an exponential technology change, coupled with ongoing series of negative security events happening all over the world, it is a really good time for all major corporate disciplines to come together in a more structured and consistent way in order to assist their company in meeting their corporate goals. ARMA Saskatchewan is providing this sequence of presentations to facilitate a much deeper understanding for strategic professionals of some of the major information management disciplines, as well as members of senior management who are interested in the positive impact that information governance might have in their organizations. The 101 presentation sequence actually finishes today, as I said earlier, with RIM 101, which will set the stage for a more in-depth RIM presentation at a later time. At the conclusion of this series, there will be an information governance event as well. Presentations will all be recorded so that they may be viewed at a later date. You could use the recordings to foster internal discussion on topic by hosting events such as the Lunch and Learn and other types of events in your corporation. We hope that you have attended this full series of important and thought-provoking presentations, and if not, they are available online at http://ig.westernim.com, and they're under the resources tab on that page. So http://ig.westernim.com. So the question many people ask is, how well are we doing now? And on a scale of 1 to 10, are we a 1 to 3? Are we a 4 to 7? 8 to 10, or as some of my friends often joke, they indicate some days they think they're a -1 in terms of how they're doing in their programs. So I like this wise saying. I'm not even sure where I got this originally, but I think it's always kind of hung in there. I've always liked it. An organization's records contain its institutional memory, an irreplaceable asset that is often overlooked. The only way that an organization can be sure it is in full compliance is by operating a good information management program. Or I might change that now to read a good information governance program. I put that wise saying in several pleasant presentations over the last 20 years, and I think it's still very appropriate today. So I thought I'd just drop it in at the start of the presentation. I think at the time I first used this, though, paper records were the largest percentage of records in most of the organizations I dealt with. I think you'll agree this sentiment still resonates today. So regulations, I think all of you on this webinar today are dealing with a multitude of legislation and regulation. In Saskatchewan, of course, we have the Archives Act. Federally, we have PPETA, which, as we have become aware in the last couple of presentations, will likely be modified and enhanced with extended requirements so that the European Union will consider it like legislation to the GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation, which comes into effect the end of May this year. I'm sure you'll all agree that we're very close to the end of May already. Those of you in the health sector are definitely familiar already with HIPAA legislation, both here in Canada and maybe some of the other HIPAA legislations around the country and or the US. Virtually all of us have had to deal with freedom of information requests for many years. This is just the tip of the iceberg. The one thing I've noted over the years is the current volume of legislation and regulation is ever expanding and really difficult to adhere to the myriad of requirements to ensure all that corporate compliance. I have always considered records and information management professionals to be truly amazing and multifaceted people as they strive to keep their corporations compliant. So as always in this presentation, we'll take a closer look at education available related to the records and information management discipline as a starting point. There are several directions a person could take, those being certificate, certification, or some higher level education that may be available. But before we talk about certificate or certification and others, we should start with the normal historical training course for records and information management, which is somebody at the office that tells you how you're supposed to do the job, even if they weren't actually trained themselves prior to starting the work that they were currently doing. This could also take the form of joining ARMA and asking all your colleagues and friends about how you should be doing things in records and information management. Please don't think I'm knocking this kind of training, because that's how I learned almost 30 years ago from my friends in ARMA. I do, however, believe that there are other ways to learn now as well. Certificates these days can generally be done online and usually require a little less study time than the certification, and certainly a lot less than the higher education routes available. So here's some ARMA certificate options available right off the ARMA website, ranging in price from $300 US up to $1,300 US. So if you wanted to take a quick certificate course online, you could certainly do that. From an educational standpoint, a certificate could be received from many different locations, however related to the records and information management field. But this is a sampling from the ARMA website, and of course ARMA is almost always the best choice for records and information management information. The other thing about certificates is that they don't usually require any kind of specific educational or work experience requirements prior to enrollment, which can be important for some folks for sure. So how about certification? So now we'll look at the next level up, which is certification. We'll give you some letters to put after your name on your business card and somewhat of a flag to wave to your corporate HR department about your career development. Certification generally requires some combination of educational background and professional work experience to enroll. The first certification we will look at is the CRM, or Certified Records Manager certification. Governing body, which is at arm's length from ARMA, is called ICRM, which stands for Institute of Certified Records Managers. This certification requires you to write 6 separate exams or parts. The first 5 parts are made up of 5 multiple choice exams with 100 questions each. I will give you a few seconds to have a look at the slide here to see what parts 1 through 5 actually look like. Since sorry, it's a little bit small probably for some of you to see. My experience after having worked with and around many CRMs over the last 20 years is that many of them, being highly qualified records and information management professionals, were somewhat challenged with Part 5, which is about technology, since they never had really worked in that area in their organizations. Now, many of you will have a much better understanding right now of that topic because of the requirement for technology related to information governance and or high-level team approach that you may be using in your organizations today. Part 6 overall, though, has proven to be one of the tougher parts to accomplish. I recall a time when I was working on an international program committee, and as a member of that program committee, I was required to audit certain sessions at the international conference. So a very good friend of mine at the time was the president of the ICRM, and the presentation I was auditing was being given by he and another past president of the ICRM. This particular presentation was a half-day session on Part 6 of the CRM exam. The way the session was presented included all of us getting a sample essay question, which we were then asked to write a one-page business case on. I was very happy that the question posed was a technology question and very much related to those things I did on an everyday basis while implementing electronic records management solutions. Much to my chagrin, though, I found that writing that one page was much more difficult than I had anticipated. I recall my friend, the instructor, saying about 10 times during that half-day session to the entire room of people, "Read the question." He said this over and over again during the course of our attempt to write the business case. Read the question. Make sure you read the question. It was certainly an eye-opening experience for me. And I just pass that along to all of you that if you decide to take the CRM certification, that reading the question in Part 6 several times is really important so that you'll answer this specifically what was asked. So how about cost for a CRM? Well, first, 100 US registration fee, then $100 US for each of parts 1 through 5, and $150 US for part 6. So if you happen to miss a part of the exam, you have to repay to take the exam again. So in a perfect world, $750 if you don't miss any of the parts. After your successful completion, $200 US per year, and of course you will need to keep up your education with approved credit style opportunities. Who's accumulating point values? Go forward for recertification. That things like going to conference will give you certification points, that type of thing, watching presentations that are related to this records and information management. Currently, CRM recertification requires 100 points over a 5-year time frame. From experience, I can tell you it's always better to accumulate those points as you go along rather than trying to do it all in a very short period of time close to the end of the 5 years. Just a short comment about the CRM versus IGP certification, which I'll talk about in a minute. In my mind, I get asked this question a lot, and in my mind, CRM is a much narrower and deeper certification related to records and information management than the IGP. So what I mean by that is that if your choice for your career is specifically in records and information management, then the CRM is a really good choice because it's really more specific to that discipline. The IGP, on the other hand, is more of an overarching certification that requires knowledge of risk, legal, IT, security, and privacy, as well as a somewhat deeper understanding of records and information management, and would likely be more helpful in your personal goals if those personal goals of yours point toward a wider corporate vision in the end. So if CRM sounds a bit too hefty, then the new CRA Certified Records Analyst certification might be just the thing for you. As you can see on the slide, we only have to write parts 2 through 4 for the CRA. And then, of course, you could combine that later with something like an IGP certification. So there are lots of ways to combine different certifications into a really positive career outcome over time. And now, last and not least, is dear to my heart, IGP certification. So the exam consists of 140 multiple choice questions, and you're expected to answer those questions in 2 hours and 45 minutes of a 3-hour appointment. Testing locations are virtually everywhere, so that shouldn't be an issue for most of you if you live in any major center within anywhere in North America. Cost is $599 US, sent in with registration, and you do need some combination, as in all the other certifications, of educational background plus some kind of experience in an appropriate combination. If you have a university degree, that usually means you need a very little amount of experience, and if you have less education, then you can qualify with more practical experience. As in the CRM needing points, the IGP needs hours of for recertification. Total of 60 contact hours in a 3-year cycle. So this averages about 20 hours a year, which is comparable to the ICRM's 100 hours in a 5-year cycle. There are, however, specialized credit requirements, though, in the IGP recertification of 10 hours required in legal and 10 hours required in IT. And the remaining 40 hours can be at individual's discretion. There is a recertification fee of $250 US that will be invoiced at the end of the 3-year period if the individual has met the credit requirement. This fee covers the individual throughout the following 3-year period. So a couple of related certifications. First one is MLIS, Masters of Library and Information Science, which is still given by several universities. I am most familiar with Dalhousie and Halifax. In fact, many of the Nova Scotia government employees in the records and information management and archive space are graduates of Dal in the MLIS program. Interesting to note, though, that the Canadian Libraries Association, or CLA for short, which was a huge organization, is no more. In fact, when we had a joint conference in Canada with the CLA and the ACA, that's the Association of Canadian Archivists, back in the early 2000s in Edmonton, we, that is ARMA, had only one conference hotel in the city as a conference location. ACA had one hotel in the city as a conference location, and the CLA had the rest of the city, just to highlight the difference in size for these 3 organizations at that time. Interesting point for me then was that the Special Libraries Association, which was a small subset of the CLA, had people staying in our ARMA conference hotel, and they all wished they had been at our conference because Special Libraries Group really did things more closely related to what we did than the mainstream MLIS folks. Of course, if you want to get really serious, you could go to UBC, University of British Columbia, and take the MAS, Masters of Archival Studies course, which would be several years in duration. UBC is very well known in the records and information management world since they've been involved in many interesting projects over a period of time, like the original Department of Defense DoD 5015.2 certification process back in the early 90s, among others. All the resources I use for this presentation are ARMA-centric or dredged out of almost 25 years I have been involved in the records and information management profession. So now let's talk about records and information management standards, which are very important in this discipline. So first thing I wanted to talk about is kind of the oldest standard, information and documentation records management ISO standard. That's 15489-1 and 2. And part 1 of you'll note I have a 2001 and 2016 in the header of the slide. The 2001 document is about part 1 is about 26 pages, and it's the general document, whereas the part 2 is the guidelines document of about 46 pages in length. Why, you ask, do I list both 2001 and 2016 on the slide? Simply because the new 2016 version of the document is being released very shortly. General version of 2016 document at 30 pages is available now at about $180 US, and the guidelines document is not yet released. Approximately the same kind of price range for the guidelines document in the 2001 version. So you can get them at TechStreet. Just go to techstreet.com and you'd be able to acquire them if you decide to do that. When the original ISO standard was released in 2001, it was at precisely the time of the joint CLA, ACA, and ARMA conference in Edmonton And in fact, we did announce that standard at the joint conference. For some time, ISO 1549 was the only standard for records management available, and as such was what everybody used for assessment and strategic planning purposes for their organizations. Until in 2009, we wrote the ARMA principles. At that time, short formed as GARP for Generally Accepted Record Keeping Principles, later required to be renamed as the Principles. After the ARMA principles was released, in general, most people use those ARMA principles instead of ISO 1549, based on my experience. And in fact, that would be true for our organization as well. We use the principles exclusively after that. Although we did still pay attention to 1549, the principles was the main focus of any assessment and strategic planning. One provincial government and one territorial government that I introduced the principles to adopted them as a standard within 2 weeks of getting their hands on it. So it's very widely accepted in North America for sure, and around the world. So the ARMA principles were written with simple business language in mind, since up till that point in time-specific records management language, we always used kind of records management language to publish documents in the published documents, and it was very hard for business people, I think, to deal with that. So when we wrote the principles, we tried to keep in mind what GAP had done, the Generally Accepted Accounting Principles had done, and their long-term popularity with the chartered accounting professionals, while we crafted the ARMA principles in a business language form. So I think that's what's really important about the ARMA principles, is it's in business language and easy for senior management people to read and understand. So this will just give you a bit of a graphic vision of the timeline that occurred while moving to information governance across information governance. So the early 90s brought enterprise content management, scanning, and imaging solutions. Some of these names may be familiar to you: PC Docs, FileNet, Foremost. Foremost, by the way, was the first electronic records management system in the world, built in Canada by Provenance Systems, later named to TrueArc, and eventually acquired by Documentum. Truth is, though, that at that point in time, most records management was still done in paper. We wrote the principles in 2009 and then rewrote them in 2012. I might add that during the rewrite in 2012 was the very first time that I ever heard or used the words information governance. So that's kind of the first blush of information governance, was when we rewrote that ARMA principles and added those words into both the principles and the maturity model. By 2013, the ARMA IGP certification was actually born, and the first IGP board was struck in 2014. In the following 4 years up till now, the IGP has been enhanced and has been widely accepted, while ARMA has further developed the IGBOC, the Information Governance Body of Knowledge, which is available to all professional members of ARMA International on the new website. So for all of you that are professional members, paid members of ARMA International, you're allowed to go and pull down that IGBOC, the Information Governance Body of Knowledge, which is in its infancy today, but you can pull that down in PDF format, which is kind of cool. As you can the ARMA principles as well, and the maturity model. So just most of you know about the principles maturity model, which can help your organization determine where they stand on a scale of 1 to 5 for the 8 principles. I thought it would be good for any new to this concept if we just spoke to the maturity model just a little bit. As I said, in the ratings run between 1 and 5, and I get asked all the time, why did you use 1 as a low and 5 as a high? Well, it just kind of worked out that way. Suffice to say that you don't want to be a 1, and you probably can't afford to be a 5. So 3 is really where you really want to be as an organization for all of your 8 principles. So here's just an idea. This is compliance, one of the 8 ARMA principles, and this is level 3, where you really want to be. So sample. Says your organization has identified key compliance laws and regulations, and that you are systematically carrying out the creation and capture of information in your organization and using the information management principles. So your organization has a code of business conduct integrated into its overall information governance structure and policies. Compliance is highly valued and measured. And of course, you really need to have things be measurable because nobody pays any attention if it's not. It further states that suitable records and information demonstrating the organization's compliance are maintained. You have a legal hold process integrated into your information management and discovery processes for your critical systems. A hold process is very important if litigation ever occurs in your organization. Further indicates that you have defined very specific goals related to compliance and their exposure to adverse consequences from poor information management and governance practices is reduced. One thing I get asked quite a bit about ARMA principles is what if I only have part of level 2 done, so I've only got part of level 2, and maybe one thing in level 3, maybe we're back in level 1 doing some fixing some things as well. So maybe you have one thing done in 4. So you're kind of mixed bag across the levels 2, 3, 4, for instance. And if that's the case, you kind of have to make a critical judgment yourself and extrapolate out what that might mean. For instance, as I said, if you had level 1 still to do, and maybe had one level 1 thing still to do, and 2 was pretty much done, and you had some 4 done, and most of 3, you could say you're a 3. I mean that's a you have to take a stand on that and extrapolate it out to the best of your ability. But just before we leave the principles, I should also remind everybody that, again, that they're available free on the ARMA website, arma.org, ARMA.org. Very important thing, I believe, to the information management and information governance world. So, talk a little bit about that information governance program we saw in the ARMA principles. So now we're going to talk about that. Basic concepts. This is basic concepts of record and information management, since this is a 101 presentation. So we do have to talk about the basic concepts. Not everybody knows what all these pieces mean. For those of you who have been in records and information management for, let's say, a fairly long time, some of this might be a little boring, but to others it might be new ground. That's why almost every ARMA chapter in the world, when putting on a seminar, has basic tracks on records and information management, because there's always people that are new to the profession. Just a quick note that we do talk about records and information management interchangeably in many cases. Records was the old terminology. Information management was the newer and broader terminology. But just so that we're all clear, information governance is not the next incarnation of records information management, but an entirely different concept, which you will already have determined for yourself from our presentations. So when someone around you, that could be your own folks in your own organization, or vendors, or anybody around you, thinks that IG is just the new RM, you have my permission to straighten them out, because it is not. It is a much more overarching discipline, and not just records management over again. Having an information management program means you have a structure both in form of a classification system and a retention schedule, which tells your organization how long do we keep the stuff and what do we do with it when it's no longer required, which is all backed up by policies, practices, and procedures, and approved by senior management. All of this should exist in a safe, solid, documented, and audited environment. So what's the point of having an RM/IM program in your organization in the first place? This slide just about says it all, hopefully. It gives us legal and regulatory compliance while providing information in a timely kind of manner and protecting our vital records. By the way, vital records are those things that your corporation absolutely could not lose if there was some kind of a natural disaster, such as a flood, fire, or some other type of disaster. An example of a vital record might be your accounts receivable. And yes, we also strive to decrease storage-related costs, whether they be physical in nature or electronic. And finally, if there are requirements for permanent retention of information, that we take heed and look after it in precisely that kind of way, while guaranteeing that we can still read the information over time. Every time I say something like that, I recall that I actually sold the very first word processing system ever built in the late 70s, called WordStar, which predated WordPerfect, of course, which predated Microsoft Word. And without a viewer set today, we could no longer read WordStar files if asked to produce them in court. So just a note there, we still have to produce some of these old file types if required, and they're in our custody in organizations. Old applications widely used like Lotus 123, like WordPerfect, like WordStar, like others that have came from the past. So early on in my records management career, I wasn't much of a policy guy. But as years went on and I got to work on several policy projects with clients related to records and information management, I came to really appreciate the subtleties and complexities of policy development, to the point where they didn't put me to sleep any longer. And while reading a new policy statement, quietly in my mind, I would be saying, "Oh, good one. You know you've been converted when." My usual comment to people that are developing records and information management policies for their organization is to keep them compact and give them some teeth, so that they can some kind of penalty if not complied with internally. Short of the policy, less senior management ever has to change it, and the easier it is to modify and fine-tune with the use of processes and procedures. So, example of a records management policy might sound something like this. Just an example of a really short policy on information management, which states that senior management is on side, corporate culture will be trained, this is a mandatory kind of thing, we will be watching, and there are stiff penalties if you don't do what's right. So one of the policy engagements I was on at one point in time with a fairly large organization had about 20 people in the policy development group, from vastly different areas of the corporation. It took 4 days to develop the records and information management policy, and was then adopted by the corporation. It was a very eye-opening experience for me. That was one of my first large policy development engagements I was ever on. It's very difficult developing policy documents and statements, but again, keep them as short as you can. So talk a little bit about classification structure. So a classification structure is really nothing more than an appropriate structure for information to be put into your corporation. So that's where people put things away. When I started in the business, most of the classification systems in this country were block numeric and had numbering systems, something like 100-10-1 or 1000-100-1. It was very cryptic, and the titles were somewhat cryptic in a lot of ways as well. Many of my customers in those days were government, and some had more than 4,000 block numeric classifications. I even touched clients in those days that were using Dewey Decimal systems, since the people in their records management area had come from a library background, and they were quite familiar with Dewey Decimal from the library background they had. Later on, people started to use a functional classification model for their classification systems. These were made up of functions and activities within the functions. For those people in areas like government whose structures changed on the whim of any new government coming in, which of course happened on a somewhat regular basis, functional classification became a godsend, since functions were usually easily split up and moved to the new departmental groupings that almost always occurred after the change in government. This was not the case for the old block numeric systems. It was very difficult to shift things around when groupings changed in organizations. Other thing that has come to everybody's salvation was the use of a new concept called the big bucket theory. Big bucket theory is all about a corporation culling their classification system down to a few hundred accounts instead of having thousands. For instance, one classification might be reports, which could take in an awful lot of ground instead of the myriad of subgroupings that had occurred in the past with older style structures. Benefit of functional classification and big buckets was that users better understood where to put things away than they ever did in the old block numeric days, so adoption rates rose. Here's a quick sample of an early functional classification system from a provincial government here in Canada, not Saskatchewan. In fact, prior to their doing functional classification development, this was one of the organizations I mentioned had thousands of block numeric classifications to deal with, so they culled it down rather dramatically into a much more organized and functional classification model. So the retention schedule, one of those things that many people find hard to develop on their own. There are tools available that can assist in the legal research of how long do we keep everything and what do we do with it in the end. But the basic process to develop one is as follows. For any given classification, you explore all the legal requirements which come from various directions, like provincial government, federal government, trade organizations, Canada Revenue Agency, many other areas. Where then take the longest retention period from all of those researched areas as a base for that part of the structure. Now you're going to go back to the business units in your organization that will be using these classifications and ask them if there are any business reasons why the information should be kept longer than the required length of time based on legislation and regulation. So you find the base, you go ask the business unit, any reason we need to keep this stuff longer? An example of that might be that legislation and regulation requires employee and pension information to be kept for, say, 20 years after employee retirement, and the organization actually finds out that they are continually requiring information after the death of an employee that has been retired for 30 years. So, maybe the business case is we actually need to keep this stuff for 30, even though the requirement's only for 20. So that's how that gets developed. Some jurisdictions actually have legislated retentions. One that comes to mind most readily for me was Family and Children Services in Alberta, where legislated to 100 years all the records. So imagine that's not just paper, that's electronic records. Think of having to keep them, keep the ability to read that stuff over 100 years of time in electronic form. This, of course, really brings to mind the example I used earlier, and if they were electronic, we could see, can we actually see those records from 100 years before? Just another thing to take into consideration when you're dealing with electronic solutions in your organization. Finally, once developed, the retention schedule needs to be approved by your corporate legal department and senior management. So a couple of other points of note is my usual guideline into clients is every 2 to 3 years you need to go back and revisit your retention schedule. If you leave it longer than 3 years, it's pretty much useless. You need to actually go every 2 to 3 years and revamp and re-explore your retention schedule in your organization. Records disposition. So we talked about retention. Now what happens when we need to dispose of information in the organization? Well, if it's paper, once we know what needs to be destroyed, we will have to find it. And you got to find it. Where is it? Is it in the back room? Is somebody's desk, record storage area, Iron Mountain, wherever? But we have to find it. Pull it out of storage and then have it shredded after sign off by the appropriate person in the organization. We probably also want to get a shredding certificate to a certificate of destruction from whoever shreds it. So don't just send it away and hope that they did the job. There's been some bad stories about that in the past. You want to make sure you get a certificate of destruction for the records that were shredded. Records management professionals only under very rare circumstances would destroy something without proper sign-off from an appropriate individual in the corporation, so just something to keep in mind. This is great if you have paper records. What if they're electronic? Without some form of electronic tool to deal with these electronic records, it's more than challenging to try to delete electronic information which has come up for disposition. Further complicating this situation, of course, is the possible requirement for legal holds on your electronic information based on potential litigation that may require records to be held even though their retention date has been reached. So not to throw something else at you, but what if the event that causes information to come up for disposition is a triggered event, such as 30 years after retirement, which would require us to put a retirement date into the system so that the clock would start to count and the information would come up for disposition in 30 years. Records management has always looked fairly simple on the surface, when in reality it's really complex. So now I know inactive physical records isn't something you thought you might see in this presentation today, since paper records are not the topic of discussion they used to be. I put this slide in so that we could speak to the issue of existing physical records / paper storage that most of my clients still have. In fact, in some cases, the use of paper records has grown as opposed to shrunk. The problem I see these days is really that many organizations I deal with still have a lot of boxes of paper that are stored everywhere. Some is off-site, some in off-site storage, some in many warehouses of their own facilities. Age-old issues still apply of boxes being stored under water pipes and all of those things that existed years ago when paper was the primary method of records management. People have talked for years about backfile converting, i.e. scanning the paper they had since there was no backup of paper records that exist. But of course, in a scanned electronic form, backup could be accomplished. The trick is that much of what everybody has in paper form could have been disposed of years ago, if only the clients knew what they actually had and had a current classification system and an approved retention schedule. Okay, I've said my piece, and that boils down to you need a current classification system, an approved retention schedule, and you actually need an idea of what you have in paper storage currently. Okay, you also need to know what you have in electronic format as well. The only way you get that is an inventory. At the end of a proper inventory, you should have marked existing items that can be destroyed, inventoried what currently exists in paper form that needed to be kept, which will aid in freedom of information requests and litigation, as well as a listing of any high-value paper records that may ultimately be scanned or OCR'd and preserved in electronic form as a backup, and likely as a convenience copy for anybody with the security clearance to actually see it in electronic search. You will note that the bullet points show the traditional and proper method of doing disposal, but that these methods and processes may not actually work today in the electronic world we live in. If senior management determines that they want to do business intelligence on information in the corporation, it is still appropriate to destroy the information that we once considered as, is it still appropriate to destroy that information once we considered as being up for disposition? Further to that, even if we do disposition on records and information that we know about, with all the electronic means possible of storing information, are we actually certain that once we dispose of any information that there aren't copies lurking around every corner that we're not aware of? Might it not be appropriate today to conceive of a global retention for all the information that isn't actually records? Remembering, of course, that records only equates to about 10% of all corporate information. That might look like 5 years after creation, if not classified as a corporate record. In the meantime, information would come up for disposition. Kind of thought-provoking. And I do have several government clients looking at that issue now and trying to determine if it's feasible for them to actually set that kind of global retention on stuff that they have that isn't necessarily classified as records. So that they can get rid of it, because right now, in a lot of cases, it's just out there forever. So suffice to say that disposition or disposal of electronic information is becoming a much more complex topic due to the internal corporate discussion about business intelligence and the move away many have made to a hybrid cloud environment. So many of the cloud environments available today for specific tasks don't even have retention and disposition rules available for the information they hold. So again, something that whole information governance approach to everything, if you're going to a cloud or a hybrid cloud environment, you need to take all of this into consideration when looking at that particular issue across the board. So some days I long to have the difficult issues we had 15 years ago on the electronic side, since the complexities have continuously gone up exponentially, as well as conflicting issues of trying to chart a course through the new habits of users in, say, 4 different generations who may all be working in any given corporation today at the same time on a multitude of electronic devices, which actually change continually. So it's not exactly easy to deal with all of these electronic issues today. Well, here we are back at our closing slide of information governance relationships. First of all, I'd like to thank you all that have taken this journey with me through the various disciplines which interrelate in our quest for information governance. If anything is obvious to me after this exercise, it is that we desperately need all of our disciplines to understand each other at a much deeper level while working together to achieve the corporate goals arrived at by senior management. An obvious takeaway for me might be that if your corporation has no formal risk management practice, that RIM groups might be able to take on the responsibility of the risk related to specifically information in the corporation, while working hand in hand with IT, security, legal, and privacy. The biggest common denominator of required bodies of knowledge for certification in all of these disciplines does appear to be risk management. And this is one of the reasons why we've seen, I think, such an increase in corporations doing risk management over the last 5 years, is it ties into virtually every professional discipline that you can see as a body of knowledge requirement for their certification. So if you haven't looked into the information governance professional certification with ARMA in any great depth, I urge you to consider it as part of your career development going forward, because nothing is going to get any easier, and all disciplines are going to have to work together and collectively take some of the complex wrinkles out of today's corporate environment. So stay tuned for 102 presentations in the future, and thank you so much for your time today.